Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to the summer of 2011 and taking a look at Dragunities. So this is an interesting strategy. The summer of 2011, especially the early portion of the format, was really exciting. We saw limitations to cards like Gateway of the Sixth after it dominated the YCS that took place in Dallas. And when the summer transitioned over, we saw sort of these watered-down versions of power decks like Six Samurais with just one Gateway, but also some strategies that had been solidified from the format prior. Gravekeepers, for example, were still there, but instead of having 3 Royal Tributes, it only had 2. X-Sabers was absolutely still a top-tier deck. It also, at this point, has no more Rescue Cat. In addition to that, we're going to see new strategies pop up. Worms, a deck that we recently profiled, not necessarily right when the format began, but as the format began to progress, was released. Eventually, sort of by the middle to late format, we'll get Extreme Victory, and that brings massive changes with cards like Reborn Tengu and Tour Guide. But today we're going to take a look at a deck that was one of the more popular decks when the format first began, and that's none other than Dragunity. Dragunity is a really cool deck that gets to combine the Dragunity package with a trap lineup that is very reminiscent of at least how you would conceptually build a deck like Teledad. Why make those comparisons? And a lot of people back in the day made these comparisons. When you have cards like Cards of Consonance and Terraforming and Dragunity Ravine, you have this inherent consistency. And ultimately, the purpose of the deck is to put big synchro monsters on the field and then back it up by trap cards. Kind of inherently what, theoretically at least, what Teledad was trying to do under most conditions. This deck did a pretty reasonable job replicating that type of strategy. What's really interesting about this particular format in Yu-Gi-Oh's history is this is a time period where we used to have what we used to call field spell wars, where field spells could actually destroy the opponent's field spell. So in the mirror match or even against Gravekeepers, there was that field spell dominance where you would actually need multiple Dragunity Ravine or Dragon's Ravines to actually play the prolonged game, because eventually yours would get destroyed by your opponent's field spell and you'd kind of want to go back and forth. And it's really important to have a field spell with this particular strategy, because when this deck gets rolling, every single turn, instead of using Dragon's Ravine to ditch dragons to the graveyard, which might be what modern players think when they think about Dragon's Ravine, there's actually a second effect on Dragon's Ravine, where instead of sending a dragon to the graveyard, you can add a level 4 lower Dragunity. And if you're familiar with the Dragunity monsters, which of course we'll talk about in the deck profile anyway, every turn you can summon Dragunity Ducks, bring back Phalanx, go into Vajrayana to level 6, and then from there you can either double Vajrayana's attack for the turn or just go into level 8, which is the primary play. And if uninterrupted, if you're able to do this multiple turns in a row, eventually you can summon a Trident Dragon and kill the opponent with one giant move. Really one of the more exciting things that this deck could do. It's a cool deck. It was really popular at the beginning of the format. Jerry Williams and Fraser Smith both topped the YCS, the Chunk Covert one in Charlotte when the format first began. By the middle stage of the deck, it kind of fell off in popularity. And honestly, Dragunities itself really wouldn't become popular again until Dragon Rulers came out. But at least at the beginning of the format, this was definitely a deck that you had to consider. It was one of the more explosive, but also controlling decks that was apparent at the very beginning of the format. But nevertheless, let's take our very first deep dive look at Dragunities.
All right, first we'll start with Dragunity Ducks. It's really difficult to win without seeing Ducks, right? Ducks is your primary way of actually getting into some of the larger synchro monsters. But we're going to play 3 copies of Ducks and 3 copies of Legionnaire. They both serve a different function. Ducks allows you to special summon the Phalanx that's attached to it and then go into level 6, which then allows you to summon Dragunity Vajrayana, which then allows you to go into level 8, which is really where this deck wants to be. The Legionnaire has another function where you get to equip a Dragunity from the graveyard, and then you can pop a face-up monster opponent controls. It also allows you technically to summon Phalanx to give you access to level 5 synchro monsters, which this deck is going to play a couple of. In addition to that, if you summon Ackley's, I believe is what it's called, it allows you to actually not only destroy a face-up monster on the field, but also destroy a card with Ackley's effect itself. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. So as I just alluded to, there's a couple different tuners. There's triple Phalanx and triple Ackley's. So we'll first start with Phalanx, because it's usually the one that results in actually winning the game. The other one just kind of incrementally builds up card advantage as the game goes on. So with Phalanx, when it's equipped to a Dragunity monster, you can just special summon it to the field, and then it's a level 2 tuner. So the best position here is to go Ducks, summon Phalanx from the graveyard. This special summons itself, and all of a sudden you have access to a level 6. I'll even preview the extra deck where Vajrayana is located. When Vajrayana hits the field, then it allows you to summon the Ducks back from the graveyard, and then that can be special summoned to the field, and then you can go into level 8. Or you can actually just tribute this off to boost this monster's attack, to double the monster's attack for the turn. Both of which can sometimes, depending on the situation, be warranted. But that's what Phalanx is there for. It's the primary tuner that you're going to be using. And then with Ackley's, as I alluded to a moment ago, if it's sent while equipped to really technically anything, but it's basically only going to be equipped to a Dragunity monster in this deck. But when it's sent to the graveyard while it's equipped to a monster, you can destroy a card on the field. It technically has another effect where if you normal summon this, you can special a Dragunity from your hand and then equip this to it. So technically if you open both of these, you can normal this, special this from hand, and then equip this from the field to the spell and trap zone. And now you can, again, as I alluded to, pop a face-up monster, and then this card will destroy any card on the field as well. So this deck has really two lines of play where it has a little bit of a card advantage one, and then one that accesses the extra deck. Technically, you know, Ducks can summon Acklys, but it doesn't really accomplish too much. And then, as I alluded to, Legionnaire can summon Phalanx, and then it doesn't accomplish a ton, but you can go into a level 5 synchro, or you can technically just ditch this to pop a face-up monster, and both of which are totally reasonable depending on the situation. But that's our Dragunity package, and then Fraser elected to play 2 copies of Effect Veiler. So we're at a point in Yuga's history we don't necessarily see a ton of hand traps, but we see cards like Effect Veiler from time to time. In this format, it does a decent job against the mirror match, actually, right? If you Veiler Ducks, you know, this is a format where there's not a lot of extender, so that actually stymies them for a turn. And if you get the advantage of being the person who's basically one iteration up, where you're always the person resolving Ducks, and then you counter them, you're basically going to win the game. So if you Veiler their first Ducks, and then you just Ducks loop through Ravine for the rest of the game, you're probably going to win. So there's some advantage there. It has some application in other matchups, right? It's good against Debris Dragon. It can be good against Kageki, right? Technically, 6 Samurais can still special summon with Grandmaster and Kazan, but they're not likely going to be able to access the extra deck if you use Effect Veiler on Kageki, because it's hard to actually put a tuner on the field unless they're playing the Asceticism version, which wasn't overwhelmingly popular. As a result, Veiler has some utility there. As a whole, it's a pretty decent card. It's kind of at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where it's just starting to see some popularity. It had only been out, you know, let's say approximately 6 or so months, somewhere in that vicinity. But that's our monster lineup. Then for the spell lineup, really the most important card in the deck is getting access to Dragon's Ravine. So Dragon Ravine has a second effect that if you play Modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you probably don't see happen a lot, but if you go back and play some retro formats, it actually does matter. Typically, people are wary of the Foolish Burial effect, where you can ditch a card in your hand to Foolish Burial Dragon. That effect is still important because you actually do need to get access to Phalanx. It has another effect, though, where in addition to being able to Foolish a monster, you actually can use the other effect, which is to search your deck for level 4 lower Dragunity, which means for the entire game, you can basically get access to Ducks, where once you get Phalanx in the graveyard, you can, every single turn, search a copy of Ducks, and then every single turn you have access to the level 6 and to level 8 synchro play, as I alluded to earlier, which is absolutely huge. You know, the best case scenario, you're ditching Phalanx with Dragunity, with Ravine to search a Dragunity, and then it's even better because you already ditched this into the graveyard. You can technically search this if you absolutely need. You can technically Foolish this if you absolutely need, because it is a dragon as well. So it gives you some utility there. Technically, this isn't a dragon. This is actually a winged beast. So not that you would want to Foolish it, but you wouldn't be able to. This is the one that you would Foolish or Acklys if you absolutely need to, which is also a dragon. But it gives us some flexibility there. As a result, we're going to play the 3 copies of Ravine, and we're going to play the 3 copies of Terraforming, in addition to just playing 6 copies because it's critically essential for this deck strategy. This is a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where there's what we used to call field spell wars, where if you activate a Ravine, you get to use it, and then your opponent activates Ravine, and then it actually destroys your Ravine, which means there can only be 1 field spell on the turn on the field at one time. In a format where there's both a Necro Valley and Dragunities playing Ravine, it's actually really important because Necro Valley and Dragon Ravine are critically essential to those deck strategies. Necro Valley not as much as Ravine, but definitely Ravine, and as a result, you always want to have access to either Terraforming or Ravine, so you can essentially use it as a pseudo MST, in addition to that, reestablishing the card that's pivotal to your strategy. So having 6 copies for consistency is important, but it also can act as a pivotal piece in the mirror match, and then even against Gravekeepers. After that, then we have some additional synergy cards here. We have 2 cards of Consonance, so technically we only have 5 targets with the lower Dragunity monsters, the Acklys and the Phalanx. But you do get to tutor them out when you need, right? Earlier I said, technically when you search a level 4 or lower Dragunity monster, typically you're searching Ducks or Legionnaire, but if you have cards of Consonance, you can search Phalanx if you absolutely need to, and then obviously there you're going to be able to use a pseudo Pot of Average, or Pot of Greed effect where you're ditching it to draw 2, which is fantastic because the monster you're sending to the graveyard is actually one that you want in the graveyard. So yeah, technically, you know, it's a trading card of Consonance-like effect, but when you're putting a monster in the graveyard like Phalanx, it almost feels like a Pot of Greed. So we have 2 cards of Consonance. We have 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon and 1 copy of Giant Trinade for back row destruction. We're in a format where Heavy Storm is banned, so having a lot of back row destruction is important. Then we have some of the sort of pseudo staples of the time. Monster Reborn, Dark Hole, and Book of Moon are all limited to 1. Then some cards that are somewhat unique to this deck. We have a copy of Pot of Avarice. You know, this deck typically can win the game if it gets to do 3 full Ducks iterations, but even just 1 play fuels the graveyard, and then if you get to do it on another turn, then you definitely have access to Pot of Avarice because the Vadriana plus the Ducks is 1 + 2 plus whatever the level 8 synchro is. If you do that on 2 turns in a row, you're going to be up to 5. Plus, if the game goes long enough, being able to recycle Ducks is important because this deck can run out of steam, right? If 3 iterations of Ducks is not enough, you might not be able to win the game because their deck doesn't really do anything. Having Pot of Avarice at least gives you the out to prolong it. And then Fraser elected to play one copy of Pot of Duality, which is a little bit of an interesting choice. This deck basically needs to special summon to do anything meaningful, but I can understand on the early stages of the game wanting to get access to Ravine and then using the early turns to set up. The deck has a reasonable trap lineup. This deck is 40 cards, so I can understand cutting Pot of Duality for another card, but Fraser did elect to run a single copy. Going into the trap lineup, as I alluded to a moment ago, the trap lineup is pretty robust. We have 2 copies of 7 Tools of the Bandit, which wasn't quite a staple, but was definitely included in a lot of decks. In a format without Heavy Storm, people are playing pretty large trap lineups. As a result, being able to combat other 7 tools plus cards like Solemn Warning and all the other good traps in the format can be pretty important. A couple copies of Dimensional Prison. This deck specifically can summon Stardust a lot. It's very similar to Teledad in the sense of, if you go back a few years ago prior, it felt like a lot of the time you were playing a strategy we went Stardust had a lot of back rows. Deep Prison is at least a back row that threatens Stardust, makes it so they can't just randomly attack with it. 2 copies of Warning. It was limited to 2 and arguably the best trap of the format, so we're definitely going to play it. From that point on, we have a bunch of 1-ofs. We have a couple of mass removal cards. Mirror Force, very similar to Deep Prison in what its functionality is. Torrential Tribute, just a generically powerful card, lets you play a certain game plan. Obviously, you're not using this to really protect yourself per se, right? It doesn't really function as well as a card like Mirror Force or Deep Prison when you go Stardust, set a lot of back rows. But there are plenty of game states where, your opponent has Gravekeeper Spy set, and you're like, all right, I'm just going to set Torrential. They'll flip it, search to send it, and when they use the effect, I can just play Torrential, kind of reset the field. We have 1 single copy of Royal Oppression. This deck can summon Stardust really easily, so it makes a lot of sense to play Oppression. Solemn Judgment makes a lot of sense in a deck like this. And then Fraser elected to play 1 copy of Trap Dust Shoot, which wasn't a staple. I know in formats where Dust Shoot is legal, it almost always seems like an auto-inclusion because it can basically win the game outright. But in a format without Heavy Storm, people aren't as likely to have a lot of cards in their hand if they go first. The chances are they'll set 2 or 3 back row. But I can still understand why you'd want to play it. It can basically win the game outright if you open it on the first turn. This deck has a little bit of draw power. Not an overwhelming amount, but definitely has a little bit of draw power. So I can understand wanting to include it. But that is the main deck in terms of this extra deck. We'll do that one first, like we always do. 3 copies of Adriana. This card skyrocketed in price. I remember back in the day, this card not being worth much, and all of a sudden overnight it became $25, which was kind of a lot back then for a super rare. What this card lets you do is when you special summon it, which with this deck it's going to be through using Ducks plus a Phalanx, it lets you equip a Dragunity from the graveyard, and then when you use Phalanx, you have 2 options. You either can use Phalanx's effect, which is not a hard once per turn, to special summon it, and then you have a level 2 and a level 8, which basically lets you immediately go into Stardust, Scrap Dragon, Red Dragon, and other good monsters. Or if you really need to, you can technically ditch this to boost this to 38. That effect doesn't happen all the time, but it's definitely worth noting. It is technically the highest damage output of what you have access to here, right, between this being a level 6 or just going into a level 8 outright. So it is important to know it has a secondary effect. That all comes through from 1 Dux, right? That play of being able to go Dux into Adriana is just 1 single normal summon, bringing out a level 6, bringing out a level 6, being able to bring out the level 2, and then immediately going into a level 8. So having access to all 3 is really important because technically each of the 3 Duxes is probably just going to go into Adriana outright. So you definitely want to have 3 copies. It's why I said a little bit ago that Pot of Avarice is pretty good in this deck because you can fuel the graveyard because the Dux plus this is already 2 monsters in the graveyard plus whatever the level 8 is. You have Phalanx in there too, but you don't really want to Pot of Avarice that back. Just to note, Jerry Williams, the other individual, the top 8 with Dragunity, or rather top 32 at YCS Charlotte with Dragunity, actually played more than 1 Pot of Avarice, so you can kind of see why Pot of Avarice makes a little bit of sense with how fast this deck can fuel the graveyard. But we have triple of Adriana. I'm going to jump now, because this is the most pivotal card. I'm going to kind of go back. I usually do this by level. We have Catastor and Android, as I alluded to earlier. Legionnaire plus Phalanx does give us access to level 5, so here are the best 2 level 5s. In terms of other level 6s, we do have Bryanak, right? This deck doesn't have to go into Adriana. It's not locked in any way, shape, or form, so having Bryanak is totally fine because you can easily access level 6s. Level 7 is a little bit of a difficult level to reach, but you can technically make it in some different, with Monster Reborn, for example. You don't, necessarily need to have your Android or Catastor die. You could just leave them on the field, and then the next turn when you summon Ducks, you can bring back the Phalanx, and you don't have to synchro with the Ducks. You probably would in order to go to Vadriana, and then Vadriana can summon the Phalanx, and then Phalanx can summon itself out, and then you can go into level 8 or level 7 by using the level 5 that you had from the previous turn plus the level 2. I don't know if you necessarily want to do that play, but it's at least an option. An Ancient Fairy Dragon, right, in a field spell war is really important, plus Black Rose Dragon is just a generically powerful card. This deck's going to have a bunch of level 8s because this deck really, when it's functioning to its full capacity, wants to go into level 8s as much as possible. So we're going to play Thought Ruler Archfiend and Red Dragon Archfiend, 2 of the early Synchro monsters, level 8, that are just fantastic. Double Scrap Dragon came out in Duelist Revolution with Pot of Avarice and Effect Failure. Solemn Warning as well. Some of these decks only like to play one, but I can understand wanting to play two. It really is just that critical of a card. And then 2 copies of Stardust Dragon, right? This deck can go into level 8 so easily, has a bunch of trap cards. The whole protect your back row with Stardust, even though Heavy Storm was banned, still makes a little bit of sense because there's still Bottomless Trap Hole, Torrential Tribute, Dark Hole. There's still a lot of cards that could potentially threaten MST even. Plus, the deck plays Oppression, and Stardust plus Oppression's always been a pretty good combo. And then the other card's actually kind of one of my favorite cards in this particular deck, because not a lot of decks ever got to play this card, and it's an awesome card. It's called Trident Dragon. What Trident Dragon lets you do is when it's special summoned, it can only be special summoned through Synchro. You can destroy up to 2 cards on the field, and then this monster gains additional attacks during the battle phase equal to the number of cards that you destroyed. What that essentially lets you do is it lets you pop 2 cards, and then you have a 3,000 attacker that lets you attack 3 times, which 9,000 total output is probably enough for game under most conditions. And it's not a one battle phase effect. It technically lingers on to just all the battle phase. And then my favorite card in the extra deck is one that not a lot of decks got to play really throughout all of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, at least up to the point where I really stopped playing actively, which is Trident Dragon. Trident Dragon is a level 10 Synchro, which requires just a tuner that's a dragon and then a non-tuner dragon, so it's very limited in what it requires. With this deck, if you linger a level 8 on the field, the following turn when you go into the Dux Vadriana play, instead of using the Phalanx plus the Vadriana to go into level 8, you can just leave the Vadriana on the field and then go into a level 10 Synchro by using it to level 8, and then maybe you left a Scrap Dragon on the field, and then you use Scrap Dragon to pop, cleared out the back rows for the following turn. Then you go Dux Vadriana, Vadriana brings back Phalanx, Phalanx special summons, and then you go Scrap Dragon plus the Phalanx into Trident Dragon, and then you have a 1900 plus a Trident Dragon, and then when Trident Dragon is summoned, it lets you pop up to 2 cards on your side of the field, and for that battle phase of the turn that it's summoned, it can make up to 2 additional attacks, which means it's a 3,000 that gets to attack 3 times, so it's 9,000 total damage output, plus the Vadriana that you have on the field, you're looking at over 10,000 damage output in one turn, plus you got to clear the field with Scrap Dragon. You most assuredly win the game from that. It's a really cool card. A lot of the deck's OTK potential is just using Trident Dragon. I wouldn't say out of nowhere because you kind of see it coming, but maybe with a card like Monster Reborn, it can kind of feel like it comes out of nowhere. But usually without Monster Reborn, it's basically the writing is on the wall where your opponent has that level 8 on the field, and then they're threatening a Dux play on the following turn because Ravine is sitting there, and maybe they even have Stardust Dragon to protect the Dux if they didn't want to go to Scrap Dragon. And you basically need to react because if you don't, all of a sudden they Trident Dragon you and they can just kill you out of nowhere. So that's the extra deck. In terms of some of the popular decks at the time, I actually haven't been commenting on this deck, but technically Empty Jar is the deck, though I'm not going to really be putting anything in the side deck for it. I said in the last video that maybe I should put Machina down, so I've included that. We have Worms, which we recently profiled, Gemini Hero. We have more for the Hero deck, Fish OTK, Swap Frog-based decks, usually Undyne-based combo decks. We have Six Samurai, Gravekeepers, Infernity, Plants, TGs, Agents, my favorite deck, X-Sabers. And then technically at Orlando, there was a zombie deck, but I don't think that deck was all that great, but it is technically within the realm of possible decks that you can counter. I think that's a pretty reasonable encapsulation of the format. One of the interesting things that Frazier did is he played Cyber Dragon without putting Chimera Tech anywhere in his deck. I definitely would cut something for Chimera Tech. I would actually cut this card, Massacre Restrict, which he included. That would be the easiest without really tweaking the integrity of Frazier's original deck. But I definitely would find a spot for Chimera Tech somewhere because you could run into a machine deck and really regret not having it. Interesting card choices. There's 2 copies of Puppet Plant. Puppet Plant's basically a brain control version of a monster for spellcasters and warriors. The monster that you're going to take more often than not is Shien, right, out of the Six Samurai matchup. And then if you can use a Phalanx, you can synchro summon the Shien into something like Black Rose Dragon. That's another reason it's really critical to have those level 7s in the extra deck. Or you can use Acklys. You don't technically need Phalanx. Either of them are level 2 tuners. So in either case, you can just take their Shien, normal summon a level 2 tuner, and then blow the field up. You can technically summon Valor too. But it basically gives you a brain control that your opponent can't negate with Shien, and then you inherit the Shien effect, which is huge. Whether it's pushing through a power play to win the game, or just ensuring that your synchro play goes through and it clears it. 2 copies of Electric Virus. This is kind of an interesting one. It's a brain control-like effect, but for primarily dragons would be the reason. Technically machines too, but I don't think you really even would want it against a machine-based strategy. It's just there for dragons. I can understand the mirror match why potentially using this is of a benefit, right? You can take your opponent's Scrap Dragon and use it, using the Scrap Dragon specifically to pop something on the field, which is pretty reasonable. You can use it on a Stardust Dragon, and then you can start to go off into your opponent's back row with their Stardust Dragon, and then, it gives you a little bit of flexibility. I don't think I would include it. I was kind of thinking about all of the potential matchups for this, and I couldn't really find one that I was super convinced was all that great. One interesting thing, though, the one thing that came to mind that I thought was pretty cool about this card is if you take your opponent's level 8 synchro that's a dragon and you summon Phalanx, you can actually immediately Trident them. And if you set a bunch of cards, you can actually just kill them with Trident Dragon on the very first turn. That's a little bit of wishful thinking in a format where there's no heavy storms and people set a lot of back row, but it is technically an option where you just take the level 8 synchro, maybe it's Scrap Dragon, you pop their one back row, you summon Phalanx, and if you have enough cards to set in the back row, you just kill them out of nowhere. Kind of an interesting thing to consider. And then 2 copies of Banisher the Radiance. This is another card that I wasn't so super sold on. It's decent in the mirror match in the sense that if your opponent can't deal with this, it's actually really annoying because they want all their guards to go to the graveyard, not get banished, so it's a little bit of a nuisance there. Technically, Dux actually increases his attack for each Dragunity you control. So although it's a 1500 regularly, it actually just goes to 17 and attacks over this, so it doesn't quite have the synergy there. It is pretty good against X-Sabers, you know, thinking about some of the other matchups. Against X-Sabers, the card can put in work, attack Emerald Blade, attack Dark Soul, you don't have to worry about it. Some of the other matchups, like even the Undying deck, if you get it early, it can be really annoying for that strategy, so I can understand some of the justification for Banisher the Radiance. But honestly, I think even a card like Macro is better if that's the way you want to go, but that's beside the point. So Banisher the Radiance. Then there's 2 copies of Dust Tornado, giving you some additional flexibility against cards like Necro Valley, which can be really annoying in a deck that wants to summon Ducks every turn. A couple copies of Chain Disappearance. I commented on this in the last video, and one thing after profiling this video that dawned on me that should have been probably mentioned in the Worm deck, this card is actually pretty good against this specific strategy, because if you hit Phalanx, it banishes that Phalanx, and then all of the Phalanxes in their deck, which is critical because if the opponent loses all of their Phalanxes, whether it's in their hand, their deck, and the one on the field, then they can't really go into the extra deck the way they want. They can technically still find ways with Ackley's, but it's not nearly as good. So hitting Phalanx against this deck is actually pretty critical. Then we have a couple copies of Royal Decree. I totally love Royal Decree in this deck. The deck has a bunch of traps, but you can totally flex in the Royal Decrees against a deck that has a lot of back row, and then your Synchro Monsters go way over the top of a deck that can't function without their back row. And then 1 copy of Mask Restrict, which may be there for Fish FTK and the Frog Monarch deck. I think this should easily be a Chimera tech if we go back and kind of revamp this, but this was Fraser's side deck, so we're going to keep it the way it was. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.